Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Move Crush Count. I'm your host, Scott Joseph. Excited to have a very special guest with us today. If you've had an opportunity to follow this man on social media, if you haven't done it yet, I should say, you owe it to yourself to do so. He has very actionable, immediately actionable insights that you can apply and help your communication skills immediately. Let's welcome Brenden Kumarasamy. He's the founder of MasterTalk. Welcome to Move Crush Count, Brenden.
Hey, it's great to be here, Scott.
All right, so let me announce and say thank you to our sponsor. Move Crush Count is proudly sponsored by J&L Marketing, the digital and direct marketing agency that helps you outsmart your competition so you can quit trying to outspend them. So check out jnlmarketing.com today and check out how their innovative approach will help you move the crowd, crush the competition, and count the money. We're going to have a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk about mastering the art of virtual presentations. And I know a lot of people were doing those prior to COVID, but since COVID, those have picked up a full head of steam. So it's critically important that you're as good virtually as you are in person. So Brendan's going to be sharing with us how to engage the audience, how to create impactful visuals. He's going to talk about delivering your message with confidence. All of this, we know it's important in person. I think sometimes we feel like virtually maybe we're not as good. So we're going to dive into all this, and we're going to be a rock star by the time we're done. Sound good to you?
Sounds great.
All right, let's dive in. What do you think are the key differences, I would ask, between the virtual and in person?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. So the three main differences is eye contact. Let's start there.
Yep.
Eye contact just means that when you're in person, you tend to move your body around the different people who are in the audience. But when you're online, whether you're speaking to 1 or 10,000 people, you have to look in the same place, which is the camera lens, because it creates an illusion that you're staring into everyone's eyes at the same time. That's number one. So look at the lens. The second key difference is energy. Let's face it, Scott, it's a lot easier to show up with energy when you're in person than when you're online, because you could hug people, you give them high fives in person, you get lunch with them, and there's accountability. You actually have to take a shower. You actually have to show up early. You have to present. Whereas when you're online, it doesn't really matter. Like, you can wear PJs and no one will know. So the answer to that is to bring more energy in person and transfer as much of that as possible online. And then the last difference is audience. So audience just means when you're in person, let's say I want feedback from a presentation, you're right in front of me. So I'll just have lunch with you. There's no friction. I'll just get your feedback and I'll take notes. But when you're online, that doesn't work as much because the Zoom call, the StreamYard, just ends. So you have to get on calls to get feedback. Those are the main differences.
Well, first off, the first question everyone's going to know, because we're virtual here. Did you shower this morning? Are you showered like you said?
You caught me red-handed, Scott. I did not shower. I was showering in the evening, so that's why I didn't shower.
All right, so you bring up eye contact. Here's a challenge I have, and help my way to solve this, even on these interviews. So, like, I know I'm supposed to look at this green dot staring right in front of me, right? That's where the camera is. But I'm more interested in paying attention to you talking. So I can't look at both. And I know if I'm looking at you, the people watching this right now can see that my eyes aren't directly here, right? So is that okay? How do you solve that? What would be your advice be?
Yeah, it's a great point, Scott. So there's a couple of ways you can fix this. Sometimes you can create a setup at home where both of those are aligned, where the image of the guest is literally right underneath the lens of the camera. That's a setup thing, but it's a little complicated. Even though I don't have that setup, so that's why I don't recommend it that much. The other advice is honestly to mix it up. So you would switch your eye contact where you spend 80% of the time on the lens as you normally would, and then 20% of the time on the person's face. But what I would recommend specifically for you is definitely whenever you're speaking. So whenever you're speaking and communicating ideas, you want to try your best to keep your camera, your eyes on the lens as you're speaking. But then as you're listening to guests, then you can flip it around a little bit more, and people won't notice it as much because they'll be paying attention to the guest and not necessarily you since you're listening. Does that
All
make
right, so you bring
yeah.
perfect sense. So you bring up eye contact, energy, and the audience is the three big differences between in person and virtual. So my question is, how do these differences impact how someone should prepare uh, and deliver a virtual presentation?
For sure. So what's great about virtual and in person, Scott, one of the advantages is that the same principles apply throughout. You just have to change a couple of things for the medium. So for example, if I was giving advice for somebody in general to give presentations, the advice would always be to start with puzzle. So puzzle just means communication is like a jigsaw puzzle. You know those pieces we used to do together as kids? There's like 500 of them. Put them together. So now the question becomes, and you probably might know the answer to this, is when you work on a jigsaw puzzle, which pieces do you start with first and why? Any thoughts on that?
I would, I always start with the edges because they're easy to identify.
And that's the right answer. That's how most people answer, and I agree. So they're easy to identify, they're easy to find in the box, they got a little edge to them, and then you work your way into the middle. So why do I bring it up? I bring it up because in communication, often, Scott, we unfortunately do the opposite. We shove a bunch of content in our presentations. We get to the presentation. We ramble throughout the whole thing, and then the last slide sounds something like this. Yeah. So, thanks. Not the right approach. So
Yeah.
instead, what you want to do is practice like a jigsaw puzzle. The next time you have a presentation coming up, just practice the introduction 10 times, 15 times, which only takes 30 minutes if your intro is 2 minutes. Same thing for the conclusion. What's a great movie with the terrible ending? Last time I checked, terrible movie, right? So, same thing for the close, then the middle. That's how you practice presentations in general, and then you'll apply the three other points we discussed before to optimize for virtual.
Wow. So we've all had great presentations and not so successful ones, right? And I can think back when I was doing them more frequently um, early on, and let's say the agency was growing, and all of a sudden we had a really big pitch. When I think back about my preparation, and these were in person back then, this is prior to online stuff. So I can honestly tell you that I did the intro. I can't tell you about how I framed it, the remaining, but I can tell you that one thing that I practiced the most was my first 5 minutes. And the reason for it was I knew that if I could just get through, um, if I could get through that um, successfully, right, the rest would be easy for me because you do enough of these, and what I was presenting was I knew the content very well, but I didn't want to get up there because it was a big audience or it was a little bit higher pressure type deal. I didn't want to choke my way through that because I felt like if I can't nail the beginning, it's going to make the rest of it that much harder. So I wanted to come out of the gate strong and grab attention right out of the gate. So I love that advice because I can tell you, um, if you mess up early, it's not always easy to recover. And that's for big pros.
I completely agree with your point, Scott. And you demonstrated it so well with the story that you told around getting the business for the agency, which is exactly the point. Like if you start in a terrible way, people will assume the rest of your presentation is horrible and they won't give you another chance. They'll just take out their phone and go like, "Oh, this is going to suck." That's why it's so important to get the first part and the last part right. But there's another angle to that too, which is the positive of doing that. Because usually what people do, you're actually one of the few who actually practiced it in the right way back in the day, which is a lot of people when they have those types of pitches, they generally just practice the whole thing over and over again,
Yeah.
which is terrible because when you do it and the pitch is, let's say, 30 minutes, you do it twice, you're already really tired. You don't see any growth in the presentation, you don't see any momentum, and then you just stop practicing. Whereas with the intro, what's cool is that you're super well prepared. That's one that you brought up. But the other point is you actually feel much better because you go, wow, this introduction is so good. After only
Yeah.
30 minutes, I'm going to crush this presentation. So energetically, you win too.
Great point. And then what I would do is I'd tack on, right? I would sit there and I'd do this intro and I'd make sure I nailed it. And I would not bring in the next, say, section until that was nailed. And then I would only do that next section. And then, but when I practiced the next section, I started from the intro again. And then I'd go through and do that. And then I'd keep it. So by the time I was done, I had done that intro so many times. I could have done it in my sleep. I mean, it was like breathing. It was subconscious, right? So I love that. So what do you do when you have tech issues? So, and this can even be in person. I mean, this is what I would imagine what you're going to tell me here can apply in person or virtual, but tech issues come up, how do you handle that?
Right. So for me, Scott, the perspective is always practice the harder thing. It's kind of like when people ask me, "Hey, what happens if my slides don't work? Should I present with or without slides?" My advice is always learn to do both. Right? If you know how to do slides, do it, but then know how to practice without it. So that way, if your slides don't work or something doesn't happen, you can easily adapt. And let me extrapolate what you just said. It's not just tech issues. It's what if you get late? What if there's traffic? What if something bad happens? What if your iClicker doesn't work and you can't flip through the slides as seamlessly? As someone who is a professional, you need to, in whatever space that you're in, you need to prepare for worst case scenarios. And that's one of them. So the way that you mitigate for tech issues is by testing your tech, beforehand. The way that you mitigate getting late is by showing up ahead. I remember this one professional speaker told me this crazy story to make sure he was never late for a speaking engagement. He's like a paid speaker. He would always book 2 flights. Like, it's wild. So if one of the flights didn't come, he would have another one booked at the other airport and just go to the other airport and take the other flight. I was like, wild. So I never did that, but just goes to show you got to prepare for worst case scenarios.
That's extreme. I mean, we all want a presentation, whether it's virtual or in person, and we'll focus on the virtual here, that engages the audience. We want it compelling, right? Obviously, that if we're pitching, it has to be compelling, or the deal's not going to happen. So, what happens when you get? There's so many things that can happen, and there's a lot of different virtual type stuff, right? We've got a virtual podcast interview going on right now that's live streaming. You can do webinars, right? You can do different workshops. You can do an actual pitch to a potential client or prospect. What happens if you can tell they're distracted, they're not interacting with you? What's some techniques that you have to help with that?
Depends on the kind of pitch we're talking about, but if we're elaborating on the one that you specifically mentioned around agencies, the way that you win that type of business, in my opinion, is by winning before you pitch. So what I mean by that is you've already had intimate conversations with everyone in the room. So by the time you get to the pitch, it's not really a pitch. It's more of an informal discussion between people that you've already closed. That's really how I've always seen pitching. And then during the pitch, what you do, this is kind of a ninja trick you can use, is you incorporate the ideas of everyone else in the room as you're pitching. Let me give you an example. I learned this when I worked at an accounting firm called PwC. It was one of my first kind of jobs. And there's a guy, he was like one of the best at business development in the whole country. And he gave like a lunch session. I never forgot it for the rest of my life. He would stand there and he would go, "Lucy, remember that lunch that we had? We talked about XYZ, and you mentioned this idea around X, like how we can grow this, how we can start this project. Can you elaborate more on that for the team?" And then Lucy comes in for 30 seconds and goes, "Oh yeah, we talked about this, Paul, and this exactly." And to Lucy's point, this is how we're going to bring this idea forward. And then next slide. Remember that discussion we had, Paul, around how are we going to manage the comps to make sure that we're getting results? Can you elaborate on one of the great ideas you had mentioned during our board around this point? So you tell them what to talk about. Then Paul goes, oh yeah, Brenden, blah, blah, blah. So what you're doing indirectly is you're getting majority buy-in from the team. Because if everyone else who isn't bought in is going, oh, well, Brendan's already had discussions with everybody and they're already bringing up points, they're indirectly saying they're in agreement with the plan that you're developing. And that's a great way to close B2B.
That is an outstanding tip. Always look for things in these interviews that I'm the type of guy, and of course, I assume my audience is exactly like me, every single one of them. But I'm the type of guy that whenever I listen to things, I'm trying to pull out those few things that are actionable that I can take and say, that doesn't require that much preparation for me. And what you just said, that doesn't take any just consciously be aware of it and think about it. And I think that's something that would be outstanding. I can visually see that in my head playing out to perfection. I mean, I love that. Good tip. What do you think are the most common mistakes people make when it comes to virtual presentations? How do we avoid them? It's probably the better question.
For sure, Scott. So there's obviously there's a lot of mistakes people could make, but I would say one big one is lack of audience engagement. And 99% of online presentations don't know how to engage their audience properly, which is leveraging the chat. So a lot of presentations online are often static, Scott. Static just means you come to my workshop, I deliver something for 90 minutes, and then we leave. And nobody else participates. Whereas in person, it's a lot easier to get engagement because they're right there. So you go like, does anyone have a question? Lucy, do you have a question? You can like point at people. But it's harder to do over Zoom, especially since a lot of people on the call might be doing other things while they're listening to you. They might be in a work meeting. They might be doing some work in the background. So there's two strategies I've used so far, and I'm sure I'll develop more over time on how to get people to participate more. And I demonstrate this in a free workshop I deliver that's free that people can check out if they want. The first one is I use the chat. So I'll leverage the chat and I'll comment the chat. So what does that mean? So I'll say something like, where are you from? And then people type in and I'll say, oh, Casey's from New Zealand. Tom is from China. Oh, love that. You're from, oh, wow. So I'll start mentioning that, acknowledging them. Even if I mispronounce the name. So what I say in the workshop is like, hey, if I mispronounce your name, just let me know in the comments. But I've always felt that it's easier to mispronounce your name than not acknowledge you at all. And then people laugh and they go, whatever. So that's one. The other piece that I do, which is very stealth, is how do you get people to unmic and share ideas? A big mistake people make, Scott, is when they do this, they go, what does everyone think? Let's hear from somebody. And that's really bad to do virtual because there's like 60 people on the call. Yeah. So people start unmiking, they start interrupting. So here's the way you do this. I think I'm the only person who does this besides like my business partner, which is, let's say people start sharing in the chat, like, what's your biggest challenge when running meetings? And then Lucy goes, oh, my challenge is this. So I'll say this. Hey, Lucy, I'll read her response. I love your share around this. Do you mind unmiking for 20, 30 seconds? I'd love to hear your thoughts to the group. And then I'll stop talking. And then two things will happen. 80% of the time, because I know Lucy's participating because she's typing in the chat, 80% of the time she'll unmic and she'll share a thought. She'll share the idea. Oh, thanks, Brenden. She'll unmic. The second thing, 20% of the time will happen is nothing will happen. So maybe she's driving. Maybe she's in the bathroom, so she doesn't want to unmic. So if there's no noise, I'll wait 3 seconds and I'll go, I'll just give Lucy 3 more seconds. If not, I'll pick somebody else. 1, 2, and then if I get to 3, and she'll either respond or I'll go, okay, how about Jake? Jake, I loved your answer on blah, blah, blah. And I keep my composure. Jake would love to hear from you for 30 seconds. And then Jake will often come off the mic and share. That's the way you do it.
It's a great way. I'm just sitting here thinking about a mastermind group virtually where you might be getting everybody together and you might have anywhere from 50 to 100 or more, several hundred people on a call. It's an outstanding way to keep engagement and keep talking. And because to me, I can't stand being in a group where, let's say I'm in the audience and I just listen to one guy up there talk. I want to ask questions and they don't always get answered in the chat, right? They don't always, sometimes the chat gets ignored. And so to me, the back and forth like that, and that's where real relationships form as well. It's not you're not sitting there thinking, oh, this guy that runs this mastermind group doesn't know me, or the awkwardness that can come from that type of stuff. I think it's real relationships form better with that. It's not just about increasing the engagement. So I love what you just said. How
Right.
do you go ahead?
No, and the follow up to your point, Scott, that I felt like mentioning is that's the gift. The gift is a lot of people that, honestly, my advice to people is always, when people get really good at speaking, that's when they get really bad at speaking. And the reason I say this is because everyone, let's say the mastermind groups, we don't have to name who they are and what they're about. I bet you they're really good in person. I bet you a couple of them are probably really, really strong in person, but that's the Achilles heel. Because when they go in online, they go, oh, well, I'm so great at speaking. Of course, what I believe about speaking is correct, and they do a terrible job. They don't go back to who they were as beginners. Whereas what I really like about your approach, and you're really taking the message in the perfect way, which is, hey, I'm already successful. I'm already doing well in my businesses. But there's one or two things Brenden is going to share with me today that I probably am not doing. How do I bring that into my game? And it's that refinement that people are missing. But because I'm always nerding out about speaking, like when people ask me, like, are you the best in the world at what you do? I go, of course not. But that's why I'll be the best. Because I'm always saying this Scott guy's probably smarter than me in communication. There's something I got to learn from him. And when you have that mindset, you'll always dominate.
I've listened to your content, but I feel like I see more of it on Instagram than the other channels. So I do you post more there?
Yeah, we post daily on Instagram. It's just easier to digest, right? Versus like my long form content is like 8 to 10 minutes and it requires a sit down. So that's probably why.
Yeah, I love what is your Instagram? I don't have it right in front of me. What's your Instagram handle? How can people find you there?
Of course, it's Master Your Talk.
Okay. So Master Your Talk. Find him on Instagram because he provides nonstop, short little videos where literally everything he says is spot on, for one, and the advice is great. And it's stuff like what we've already witnessed here in this interview so far. And that is, these are things that they can apply and integrate into their stuff. We talked about technical issues earlier. Did I just go black on you?
No,
I just go? My screen went to sleep. I just updated my computer last night, and I got to change the setting back to do not sleep. I had to go into a panic mode there. I thought, oh my God, I lost everybody. But
you're all good.
No, but your content on Instagram is so easy to digest, and so, in my opinion, easy to apply. And they're all things that I'm like, I haven't thought of it like that. That's a good little twist on this. So I love it. I'm not just saying these things. I bring people on here. I always go to everybody's social first and look at their content. And I saw yours and I was like, man, we got to get him on. I think there's a lot of people that could benefit from it. Let's talk about storytelling. How important is it when we're communicating virtually? And then, how can someone use it effectively in a virtual presentation?
For sure, Scott. So the challenge I found with other experts teaching storytelling is it's a really vague topic. What does storytelling mean? Does it mean you got to watch Disney movies all day and take notes? Does it mean you got to open a children's book and start telling stories? It can get really complicated. So for me, the simple idea behind this is every great story starts with a key lesson or ends with a key lesson. And if you don't know the key lesson, the story falls flat. We all have that friend in our life, Scott, who goes, hey, Scott, you wouldn't believe what happened to me last week at the Kentucky Derby or somewhere else. And they start telling you the story. But then 20 minutes later, you're thinking, when is the story going to end? Like, what's the point? He just keeps talking. Where are we going? Like, what happened? So there's no structure. So the way you fix this is by not starting with the story, but by starting with the lesson. Let me give you an example from my personal kind of repertoire of keynote presentations I deliver. One of my key ideas that is probably the most common one in a podcast interview or in a speech that I give to a client or a company is simply this: convince everyone in the world or in the room that they can become exceptional communicators. So I do that through simplicity, through these ideas. So now the question becomes, what is the best story that I could tell that could help me prove that point? Les Brown always says, never tell a story without making a point, and never make a point without telling a story. And that's basically what he means here in a little bit more jargon, which is we have the key idea, and now we tell stories. But here's the punchline. The punchline, Scott, is I'm going to try 10 different stories to see what sticks. I'll try my personal story. I'll try the story of some other figure in the world. I'll try a story of a celebrity, and I'll see which one works. And of course, for me, it ended up being my personal story, which in a nutshell is I have a crooked left arm. I grew up speaking a language I didn't know, which is French, because I'm born and raised in Montreal. And I was a kid when I started MasterTalk. Literally, I coached some C-level executives who had worked longer in the company that I was alive. So the reason I tell that story is, hey, if I could go from being an accounting major to being one of the leading voices in this industry, imagine what you could do with your life in communication. So that's how. But the point here, and then I'll throw it back to you, is the story leads to the key lesson.
I'm sitting here, and I guess I'm watching this, right? And it brought up something that I was just thinking about. So when I'm in person, and I'm only exaggerating this now because this is what I'm about to ask. So when I'm in person, I talk with my hands. But when I watch, and I do that because I guess subconsciously, I think by doing that, it's emphasizing a certain thing or not, whatever. But when I'm doing these interviews, you're obviously right by me on my screen, so I can see both. I feel like I just sit here, and I feel like I'm not using my body language other than maybe facial expressions to bring a point or to emphasize, say something. So how can someone use body language in a virtual presentation? Because you're limited. You can't see everything unless I sit way back here.
You got it, Scott. So, and that actually is a good thing, which means you don't have to emphasize body language too much. That's basically the key idea, which is if you're online, the bigger mistakes you're going to make, or rather, the highest ROI activities is engaging with the chat. It's calling on people to participate. It's showing up with energy. It's doing the eye contact with the lens. Those parts most people don't get right. So if you don't get those things right, don't even touch body language. But really quickly, all you need to know, and even in this interview, I barely use it, you just want to use body language sporadically. So what that means essentially is whenever you want to deliver a key point, you can move your arms around like this. You could give like a little high five. You can say, hey, this is important. Or you could say, you can put your hand on your chest and say, hey, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm really blessed to see all of you. That's another position. But I think the key is there's no right formula here. I don't want people writing down all of Brendan's body compositions and just doing that. I think it's more of a question of just follow your style, see what works for you, and just don't overdo it. I think that's the only mistake you could really, like, if you start doing this, then you start confusing people. So just keep it simple.
When you're teaching or coaching people, do you ever have students that maybe speaking publicly, and I think public speaking can even be, if you're talking to someone that you're not super familiar with, it can be one-on-one, it can be virtual or in person. And so a lot of people have a fear of that. There's a high anxiety. They get nervous. And I can tell you, I was at PodFest. It was in January. I don't know if did you get there by any chance?
I know a lot of people who went there, but I went to Podcast Movement, not to PodFest. Yeah.
All right. So at PodFest, the speakers were outstanding, the workshops, but there was one, and her content was good. But man, she was so nervous. And it was so visible. You could tell she lacked a lot of confidence being on that stage. And I looked past it, and there was at one moment, and it was all the way, literally some people get over that in the first few minutes, but this went on for like 3/4 of the way through. So how do you coach someone? What can someone do to help prepare to reduce the anxiety, reduce the nervousness, so they can be themselves and more comfortable and express themselves the way they need to?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. For me, I won't tell you a story about how to breathe properly, how to do power posing. It's just not what I believe in, like other people would say. For me, the belief is do what's infinitely harder outside of the presentation room so that the presentation room becomes a joke. Why don't have any stress on this interview? It's not because I'm fearless, it's because I've done interviews that are 100 times harder. And I don't
Yeah.
mean better. I mean harder. Where I would take this interview. I remember this guy who interviewed me. There's a show called like Fiddly something, and they had 6 hosts at the same time, and their only job was to make it funny. And I took it on purpose because I wanted to just experience the challenge. And they would make fun of my age. They made fun of everything about me, right? And it was funny. It was a good time. But the point is, because they were berating me for 90 minutes straight, when I go into an interview like this, which is obviously more normal, with somebody who's just like, "Hey, I just want you to share tips with people, and I'm really happy that you're on the show, and I really want you to share your wealth of knowledge with people." The interview becomes very easy to manage. So the same perspective I apply to that woman. So let's say I was coaching her, I would start with the random word exercise. Hey, let's practice presentations that you have zero time preparing for, that you have zero expertise in. So I would throw something like soda pop, go give a presentation. She goes, I can't do this. But then after she does it 100 times in 2 weeks, because I'm pretty intense, as you probably caught wind of, Scott. Then after 2 weeks, she goes, oh, this is really easy. And then I just ask her a simple question. What do you think is easier? That random word exercise or a presentation that you're already a subject matter expert at? She goes, oh, that presentation is going to be a joke. And her mindset shifts, not because I threw a magic potion at her, but because she practiced the harder thing and she earned that confidence. And that's how we build up the momentum over time.
When I look back at some of our early episodes, because from day one we always did video; they weren't just audio podcast, and so I feel like visually I was nervous, and not because I was nervous in front of speaking to people or asking questions. I've done that almost my entire business career. I didn't want to look like an idiot or a fool on camera. And that's where and finally I've got a lot of good friends that the guest on the show, one of them co-host, and they all make fun of me nonstop on here anyway. So it got to the point where you do it frequently enough that went away, but also the fact that I just got to a point where I didn't care. I didn't care if I made a fool out of myself. I didn't care if I looked dumb. It's just I was better off just being me.
I agree. And we all start that way too. Like for me, like painting the picture. 22-year-old kid in my mother's basement, I had no money. That's what my first year of MasterTalk was. I literally start and they're all up there. They're all still there. You can watch the horror story that was MasterTalk at the beginning, where I'd look at the camera and go, hi, welcome to MasterTalk, and that's how it starts. And then we get better over time.
Do you think there's a lot of young people in the audience, especially young people just kind of in that first chapter of their career? And so I feel like young people, what are some common mistakes? Let's talk a little bit about this because man, I can remember back the earliest part, if I was interacting in person with, say, a client or a prospect, I can remember early on some of the veterans pulling me aside after something, after trying to sell somebody something, and they're like, "Hey, you're allowed to smile." I always thought I had to be so professional and serious, and you never let yourself actually, I think people eventually they do business with people they like. And if you're not going to be yourself and be your best self, the highest version of yourself, right? You're not, I think you limit yourself. So I think what you just said is a perfect example, right? You came off very generic at the beginning when you first started, not at the beginning of this episode, but in the beginning of your career, too worried about what everybody's going to think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My advice to young people is always the same, and it honestly applies across the board, which is you got to triple down on the people who already believe you relative to building new audiences. And that sounds counterintuitive because a lot of us we're always thinking, I need to grow, I need to grow, I need to grow, I need to get more followers. And there's nothing wrong with that. I build audiences too. But the main focus is who's believing in your message, and how can you triple x the experience of those people to make
Hmm.
their trip better. Like they're and I'm always honest about this on a podcast. I don't think the CEO of JP Morgan Chase is going to hire me as their communication coach. I don't. I don't think
Yeah.
so. They'll look at me and be like, this kid? I don't think so. Right? I'm a bank manager. I make $50 million a year. I don't need this kid to teach me how to speak. Fair enough. Banking industry is archaic. So I'm not trying to sell somebody who doesn't want to be sold. So instead, what I'll do is I'll backtrack. I'll take a step back. I'll take a deep breath and go, who's buying into my message and why? And then I realized really quickly, and that's how I built the business really early on, despite the age or the challenges that I had, was people in my own community, people who are brown, like me, who are Indian,
Mhm.
right? Because a lot of those guys, they only trust me in the industry. And that's how I built the book. So this is the advice for young people. Don't just spread or start by doing that, but then really focalize in the same way I focalized on that community, podcast hosts, right? People are super open minded to new ideas, or people who are like executive women. When you really focus on the stuff that's working, that's where you get the best results. And I think young people just don't spend enough time taking a step back and saying what's actually working and why, instead of being too impatient about the results that they're getting.
We had a great guest on here about 6 months ago, Ina Coveney, and she said something not the same but similar in a different way. And her niche, so to speak, is how do you monetize when you have a small audience? And so, but it goes to exactly the same point you just made, and that is to create. You're saying create a better experience for the people that are truly buying in or listening, those in your audience, so to speak. And what she's saying is, if you were giving 3 days to sell blank, whatever, you wouldn't go out there worrying about making social media posts and getting likes. You would be reaching out to the people that you have great relationships within your current audience and starting conversations down that path. And so if you don't have those type of relationships, when you have a small audience, it isn't, your focus shouldn't be about building, not that you shouldn't try to build a bigger audience, but that's not where your priority should be. Your priority should be building true relationships and connections with the audience you have. And so to me, that just aligns exactly with what she just said. And I thought it's a great point.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with the point, which is it's not about 1,000 followers, it's about 1,000 conversations. If you're really willing to have conversations out there, and let me spell it out for this one. Let's assume nobody's listening to the show except for you, Scott.
Yeah.
That still
Yeah.
works in my favor because I have a new friend. Right? So if I have 10,000 new friends, they'll all share the videos with everybody, and I don't need to rely on the algorithm. It doesn't matter. Right? It's just people don't spend enough time building those relationships.
My mom listens, Brenden. My mom
Oh,
listens
I'm
all the
sure in your
time.
case a lot more people than you watch it, but I'm just saying as an
I,
example.
I have to make I have to make my wife watch it. So I but outside of that, yeah, we're good. All right. So talk to me. There's always this big debate about visuals, like whether it's slide decks, and there's the camp that always says that distracts. You shouldn't have to do all these big fancy presentations, PowerPoints, whatever. What are the type of visuals you think are most important, but more importantly, what's the best way to create them?
For sure. So there's different ranges when it comes to visuals, Scott. I would say the easiest one to implement is images that you feel really resonate with the audience. I'll give you one that's a little odd in my deck, which is a picture of a 5-year-old kid. And the reason I have a picture of a 5-year-old kid who looks like me is to show people that, hey, when I was a kid, I used to struggle with communication, gets people laughing. But the main idea behind visuals is you just want to try a bunch of them to see what sticks. I'll give you a fun story around this that I think is more helpful. So I always ask my clients for feedback on how I could do better. And I was talking to this guy, and we're on a 45-minute call when I used to do these long feedback calls. And he tells me, he goes, Brenden, I really like you, but for some reason, before I started working with you, I really didn't like you. And I just went, why? And I love feedback in any form. So I'm really excited. I was like, why is that? I was like, I don't know, man. You're just successful as such a young guy. You come off sometimes as really cocky. And I said, I agree, right? Because if my communication is too perfect and I don't make mistakes, people put me on a pedestal. They don't see me as an equal anymore, which is problematic because they think I could be a great speaker, but not them. So I asked the guy, let's call him John. I said, John, how do you think I could fix this? And he goes, I don't know. So I start thinking about this and I go, how do I fix this? And I go, okay. So I went back to my free training deck and I changed a couple of slides. I added a slide of me as a 5-year-old kid when I was standing in front of on top of a car in Switzerland. I added the picture of my surgery that I was never open to sharing before, but I said, oh, let's put a picture of me in a cast. And those visuals got me results. But the bottom line is, you won't get the visuals perfect the first time. You just got to split test a bunch of images and see what works. And nobody perceived me as cocky anymore if they attended that thing.
When you're pitching something, I don't want to use the word pitch, but when you have a presentation, how much of it are you tailoring to your audience, specifically to the audience? And then if you are, I don't know, how are you doing that?
Right. So there's two parts of that. There's the sales pitch and there's kind of like the educational pitch, which is more just like an informational session. So I'm happy to comment on both. So the first side, obviously it's easy in my case because 95% of my sales are B2C. I'm not really good at B2B if I'm being honest. Even if I give great tips on it, I'm not as strong as, let's say, somebody like yourself who needs to do B2B for agency work primarily. So in my case, B2C is my specialty. So because of that, my pitch is always the same. It's always, I don't pitch 95% of the time. And then the last 5% is, hey, jump on a call, and then I'll explain the offer on the call. So that's that. But for the educational piece, what I'll do, I would say customize 20%, Scott. So I don't really customize all of it because I'm giving so many workshops. So I'd be lying if I told you I prep and I practice and I customize every single one. The way I do it is by priority of the demographic. So let's say I have 15 presentations in the month of May. 5 of them are just a relationship play. I'm like 99% sure I won't get any clients. I just want a relationship with the guy who owns the mastermind so that he brings his buddy to my program in 6 months or in 7 years. So in those cases, I'm not customizing much. I'm just showing up and I'm just delivering my standard deck. Then there's 5 other ones that will be very niche ecosystems with like 10 people on the call, but I can swear in blood I'm going to get at least 2 clients. Or even 1 is worth it for me. So for that specific type, I'm going to spend the time customizing it. Like I'm speaking to a women's executive group on Thursday as an example. That's my client's referral to that ecosystem. So I'm taking a lot more time specializing my languaging. So the tips are the same, but my language changes. So for example, if I'm speaking to women executives, I'll say something like, a lot of you, when you grow up in your careers, you eventually become a minority. Because when you get to VP, SVP, everyone around you is men. So how can you create speaking? But it's the same tips, but the context changes. Versus,
Right.
and I'll end here. And then when I speak on to engineers, it's more about, hey, you spent your entire careers optimizing a process. Why don't you bring that same systematic approach to communication? So that's what I customize, if that makes sense.
No, I think that makes perfect sense. I love it. What's the best way, in your opinion, to handle like Q&A sessions? Most
So
people just say, all right, we've saved 10 minutes. Let's go.
right. So the way I'd approach this is an exercise I teach called the question drill, Scott. So what you do essentially is you guess questions that you think other people will ask you. And you write down a bunch of them and you just answer one of them every single day. That's basically how the drill works. And that's how I developed my expertise fairly quickly. Where day 1 was, hey, where does the fear of communication come from? I remember when I got asked that question, I was like, I don't know where the fear of communication comes from. Los Angeles, New York City, you tell me. So I would spend more time reflecting on that. Then day 2 was, how do you solve for introverts? But then if you answer a ton of these questions, Scott, especially if you're running the same P&L, like the same business over and
Yep.
over again, Q&A becomes really easy. And
Yeah.
what I do in presentations, and if you're daring, you could do this, I put myself on the hot seat and I go, everybody in the room right now, I want you to write one question you have for me on communication in the chat. And I start drilling through all of those questions in 30 minutes. And that's how you get really good at the drill.
That's a great point right there. That's a great tip. But at the same time, I like the tip that you gave earlier because, man, it's just what came into my mind when you said, practicing basically how you'd answer specific questions, right? And let's face it, if it's anything like else, most of the questions we're going to get, you probably would start struggling coming up with more than 5 that come up frequently. And so you usually get those top 5 that seem to come up every time. But man, you could spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes. You did a great job. You had an incredible presentation. Someone asked you a question like, all right, how does someone develop a fear of presenting or whatever it might be? You're not real confident or not real good at articulating the answer. And all that credibility and authority you just spent 30 to 45 mil building up, down the drain it goes. So great point to that. And I wasn't thinking of it like that. So it's just another example. I love the way you approach things, man. You're always challenging the way people think. I absolutely love it. So I'm glad you're on here. How do you measure success when it comes to a presentation?
It's tough, right? Because communication is a vague topic. So let's start with the definition. And then I have an answer, so hopefully you'll be satisfied with it. Feel free to follow up. So for me, let's start with the definition. What is communication? For me, communication, Scott, which is the same as public speaking, is how do we convey an idea in a way that achieves a specific outcome for a specific audience? Let me repeat that again. How do we convey an idea in a way that achieves a specific outcome for a specific audience? And that could mean 1,000 different things. That could be, hey, let's convince the board that they should buy our coaching product or agency service for 100 grand or 10K a month retain or something like that. But that it could also mean, hey, let me convince my wife that we should have Mexican food tonight and not Chinese food tonight. That all of that is communication because there's a specific outcome that we're trying to achieve. There's a specific audience that we're speaking to, and there's an idea that we want to share to achieve all of this. So now, having said that, how do we measure success? So for me, there's kind of 2 parts to success. One is the flat outcome. Did I achieve the outcome? Gary Vaynerchuk is a great example of this. Whether you think Gary Vee is a great speaker or not, in his mind, and I agree with him, he achieves his outcome, which is getting people to post on social media, which is hiring his firm for services. Because if he wasn't the fastest growing agency in the whole world, then he'd suck. Then people would say he's bad. So that's the financial aspect. The communication aspect, which I think is more fascinating and how I think about this, is communication is like juggling 18 balls at the same time. Storytelling is one of them. Body language is one of them. Facial expression. So the way I measure success internally for how somebody's progressing and speaking is how many of those 18 balls are they able to juggle successfully. And that's how we measure success.
Beautiful. What have we not talked about that you feel like, you know what? We've talked a lot of good things, but this would not be a success if we didn't talk about this. So what would it be?
I mean, it's definitely a success, Scott, for sure. I would say the only topic I would add that I usually don't comment on too much, but because this episode is very tactical, I'll jump into something that I'm sure none of your guests have talked about, which is how to set inspiring communication goals. So a lot of us as leaders, we have goals for our health, we have goals for our relationships, our financials, but we don't really have goals with our communication. So let's say there's an owner doing, I don't know, $1.2 million a year in any business, and they want to go to 3. So what they'll do is they'll look at the guy who's doing or the girl who's doing 3 million a year. And they'll go, what are their processes? What are their systems? How do they sell prospects more effectively? They'll look at every part of the value chain, but the one aspect that they'll always fail to neglect, they'll always neglect, is how is that person coming off? How does that person that we want to be, how do they speak on a panel? How do they share ideas on a podcast? How do they come off when they're in a sales meeting? That's the missing gap that a lot of us don't comment on too much. So the way that we set these goals and how I think about it is just make a list of 3 people that you really want to become in your life. That you go, these 3 people have achieved everything I wanted to do in life, financially, commercially, relationship wise. But then I want you to pay attention to their communication skills. What is the gap between you and those 3 people? And if you can really start to reflect on this, and you could do this as an example to keep it simple today by watching a
Yeah.
TED talk of them speaking, by hearing them on a podcast, just take a bunch of notes and analyze the gap between you and them, and you'll accelerate a lot faster.
That's outstanding. And okay, so here we are, and you know what? If I'm being honest, right? There's all kinds of benefits that have come from being a podcast host. Getting to, I think a couple of them is getting your personality out there and letting people see who you are. There's obviously bringing attention to your business and or whatever you've got aligned with the podcast. Some people do it as complete income. I mean, that is their job, right? That is how they generate all their income. For me, there's been side benefits, the knowledge I gained from interviewing people like yourself and just growing myself. But let's say the purpose is to build the brand, build your personal brand, create more authority, more credibility for yourself. How can someone leverage these presentations in a way that effectively does that?
For podcasting specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, Scott. For me, I've always believed that what's
Or
great.
I should say, Brenden, let me just let's take it past podcasting, right? I mean, any presentation. If I'm a marketing guy or a CEO, and I'm doing webinars that I'm recording, could to me it could be applied the same way.
1000%, Scott. So then in that case, I'll give you 2 answers. So the first one, which is simple, because there's a lot of information, a lot of great tips, but the challenge is, what do we implement? So for me, the main idea here is, what is the repeatable presentation in your business? What is the one repeatable presentation that you find yourself giving at least more than once a quarter or once every 6 months? That is where you should be spending 80 to 90% of your energy refining. So in my case, it's my free training. That's the one I deliver 25 times in a year. So that's the one I'm going to spend 80% of my effort refining constantly. Even if it's already good, at the end of the workshop, I always go like, how do I make this better? And it's always the same presentation. That's the key. We're not switching presentations. Tony
Yeah.
Robbins has been doing the same event for 40 years, right? Like, unleash the power within. It's always the same thing.
Yeah.
So find that repeatable presentation. Whereas in your case, it's not a free training. It's when you're pitching B2B to like agencies, to businesses for the agency business. That's your repeatable presentation. Find it, target it, master it. That's one piece. The other piece for podcasting specifically, I would say people generally have the wrong set of outcomes when they guest on the podcast. I don't think getting business is the main outcome that people should aspire for. For me personally, because I don't get a lot of business from this, honestly, I would say for me, the main outcome I get from podcasting.
You are now. You're going to get. I've got your website scrolling at the bottom.
Sure.
I hope you expanded your internet connection, your bandwidth. That's the bigger concern.
You're hilarious, Scott. So for me, there's 2 things, right? There's 2 key benefits. One is the relationship with the host, just building a friendship. Because what happens a lot with the hosts I just become buddies with, not today, but in 7 years, they'll DM me and go, "Hey, Brenden, one of my best friends needs coaching. You're the only person I trust because I know you," right? So that's one. But there's another benefit, which actually is even more important than that, which is it keeps you sharp. So when you're guesting on shows and the host, who's generally good because they have a passion for it, is asking really tangible questions that makes you a better service provider. So because hosts drill me on really, like, you ask me a lot of great tactical that sometimes my clients don't even ask me. So then when I go back to my business, when I'm flipping hats, I'm able to deliver more value to them, and they go, wow, like this is so good. And I find new ideas to deliver more value and crush the results, because that's where I'm going to get most of the business. It's by word of mouth. So, and that's the outcome people don't get right, is they come on shows to sell, they come on shows just to share ideas, but not actually to provide value. And that's why they A, don't get invited more, and B, they're
Yeah.
losing a big upside that they don't see.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right. So what trends do you see emerging that people need to pay attention to uh, in terms of presenting virtually? And then, how's that going to impact how we do it in the future?
For sure, a couple. What we're doing right now, I think, is a massive trend: podcast guesting, and I'll tell you
Hmm.
why. I think podcast guesting is going to be way more prevalent in 10 years than it is today, because the problem with presentations is you deliver it once and nobody ever hears from you ever again. Whereas when you do one podcast, if the show blows up in 7 years, people will go through the archives and rewatch you. Right, that's what I did with Lewis House's podcast. That's how I got into podcasting. Right, I literally went down to episode 1 and I started listening to every episode from the beginning. So
Yeah.
that's a key part. I think any business owner needs to get really, really good at guesting on shows, because it leads to a huge brand boost. The second trend that I'm seeing is knowing how to master short form content in a way that's punchy, like the Instagram videos that you commented on earlier. There's a
They're
specific way.
outstanding.
Thank you, man. But there's a way in how to do this. There's a strategy. It's not that hard. It's you script out the video. Like I literally write out the video. I'm practicing it out loud. My family thinks
Yeah.
I'm crazy upstairs. Like literally, well, they got used to my insanity. I'm saying it out loud and I'm timing myself. That's how seriously I take my craft. And if it's over 60 seconds, I'll go back and I'll change the script. And that's so only my perfect stuff goes on Instagram. That's why I'm doing so well. That's number 2. And the third one is to get really good at virtual. I think virtual is going to be a lot bigger than people think. That's where 90% of my speaking engagements are now. I rarely do in person. It's not
Yeah.
even worth it for me, because
Yeah.
you're better off time wise. And then I'll throw it back to you, like to do 5 virtual talks than to give one in person one, because it takes you 5 hours to fly out to the city.
Where are you located?
I'm based in Montreal.
Okay. All right. Nice. We've had a few Canadians on the show. I feel like recently I'm getting a lot of Canadians. I don't know what the trend is with that. All right. So, man, I got to tell you, awesome stuff. And you just talked about how perfect your Instagram is. And we just had the Kentucky Derby here, and it was 3 days of heavy partying. And I got to tell you, I put up a video. I did a live thing on Instagram. I'm going to make a final recommendation. Never spend an entire day at the track during Derby weekend where you've had a lot of fun and then go live late at night. Never do that. Okay. So that's up there. And I thought my communication style wasn't the greatest at that moment.
I love it.
But I left it because I thought, well, it's live. Somebody's going to have it. I'm just going to leave it, and I'm going to own it. I'm going to lean into it. All right. So, all right, that's a wrap for today's episode. My voice, you can hear it's a little bit hoarse today. It's fine. It's almost fully recovered. But that's another episode of Move, Crush, Count, where we talked with Brenden Kumarasamy. I got to tell you, he's a communication expert. We were very tactical on this show, probably more so than we normally are, but I felt like you give such specific good stuff. I wanted to take the show in this direction, because that's what I want. I want, when I'm listening to a podcast, I'm not always listening to it for the entertainment value. I want some of that. I want to be interested the whole time. But man, I want stuff I can apply. I want stuff I can do right now. I want some action stuff. So that makes me better instantly. So you always deliver that. Follow this man on Instagram, and you will get stuff left and right that you can apply every day. You will learn something new. And so I highly recommend that. We've got his, and I want to make sure we've got it, the right site up there, rockstarcommunicator.com, correct?
Absolutely.
And is that the easiest way people can reach you, or should they reach you a different way?
You got it. You got it, Scott. So people can go to the website and then register for one of my next free trainings that I do. I do like workshops on Zoom, and they're absolutely free, by the way. So you can just register and you can see me actually deliver a workshop. So you get a lot more insight from the tactics that we talked about today.
Man, I'll tell you, you owe it to yourself. Visit rockstarcommunicator.com. Do it as soon as we end this episode because Brenden is a rock star. So I like the name, and he's teaching future rock stars. He's paying it forward. So check him out. Outstanding job today, Brenden. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor, visit movecrushcount.com. Make sure you subscribe so you can catch up on all our past episodes. That way you don't miss any future ones. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube. Make sure we do a lot of our interviews live, whether it's YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. So this one is streaming live. And make sure you follow us there as well. You can interact with us. A lot of times, if you've got questions during the show, we'll put them up if they're good. I don't want to say if they're good. We don't always get everybody's questions. Some of these networking formats come through StreamYard. Some do not. So we put the ones up that we can see. And if we don't see them live on the show, we try to do our best to get back on the network and answer them there. So once again, visit movecrushcount.com. Subscribe to the show. Do me a big favor. We don't pay anything for this show. All our growth is organic. So if you guys could share episodes, if you enjoyed this episode, you got a lot out of it with Brenden, share it to your friends, share it to your colleagues, rate us, review us, especially those 5 stars. We pay attention to your reviews and we try to improve the show from there. So we comment and give us some advice on there. Also want to do a final thank you to our sponsor, J&L Marketing, the digital and direct marketing agency that helps you outsmart your competition so you don't have to outspend them. Check out jnlmarketing.com today so you can check out how their innovative approach will help you move the crowd, crush the competition, and count the money. Until next time, thank you, everyone, and we will see you on the next episode.